All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Adam, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
This is an interesting one because you reached out to me a while back and said you'd been
hmm
listening to the show. First and foremost, how'd you even hear about Preacher Boys? Because it's not every day a former U.S. congressman reaches out and says, "Hey, I've been listening to your show."
Yeah, no, so it was funny because, obviously I grew up IFB until I was about 20 some years old when I left, and I was always a rebellious kid. But anyway, when I got to Congress, actually, an old buddy of mine from the church, I actually hired him, and we've been great friends. And
Hmm,
he actually discovered you and said, like, hey, you need to listen to this podcast, Preacher Boys, because we're always like back and forth going through these different traits we have or these
right.
different struggles and like, how does that relate to the church? And so when I discovered you, I'm like, man, this is like the recognition, I guess I knew I was IFB because the church was called Independent Fundamental Baptist, but I didn't recognize that it was a whole big movement,
Hmm,
and you kind of opened my eyes to that. And then seeing that there's a lot of people out there that have frankly struggled with the same things we have,
yeah.
it was a good discovery. So I figured eventually I'd reach out to you and we made it work.
I reached out and you said, I'm going to be a little bit busy in the next week or so. And then it was like bang, Jimmy Kimmel and then speaking at the DNC. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, I would have bumped myself for those too. That makes sense. For people that are listening who didn't know this about you, I want to kind of just paint the picture of growing up in the kind of independent fundamental Baptist world. Like, obviously, you didn't know it was as widespread as it is, but what was your immediate kind of circle like? And were there any big names you remember that kind of influenced your family and your church?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I would say the churches we went to, and there were a couple in there. We moved around a little bit when I was a kid, but the main one in Normal, Illinois, I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, of like 10 being the worst you hear about, it's probably a 4 or 5, right? So, we didn't do a ton with like the Andersons, the Jack Hiles. We actually held strong to independent, and didn't get involved in the broader movements of it. But there is a lot that I now can like kind of parse apart in my own spiritual journey now, where it did a lot of damage. You grew up in, I remember hearing a story actually of the prior pastor at this church that I was at, that had, there was a 7-Eleven or something, a So Convenient was actually the name of the store that opened up around the corner. And I knew the owner of that store, and he told me that like back in the late 70s, some men came from the church I was going to and told him that, that he's in the neighborhood where he can't sell alcohol. And they were kind of like intimidating him away from selling
Yeah.
alcohol. And I just remember thinking that's weird. But yeah, I mean, going to like the Marinette, everybody that graduated from the school. So it had a school as well. I didn't go to the school, thankfully. I went to public
Yeah.
school, which actually made me a bit of an outcast among some. But, they all ended up going to Bob Jones or Maranatha. So it was that kind of circle, or, the liberals went to Cedarville and, it just, that's what it was. And I remember though, it was like, again, as I mentioned, my own faith journey, not to skip ahead here, but just the recognition that, everybody struggles, and in that environment, everybody puts on a mask, right? Nobody will admit they don't have it all together, because to admit that, then they'd ask you, well, you probably were never saved in the first place. And the damage that does to people's psyche, like how many times did you get resaved,
Yeah.
and then wonder why you didn't get saved for real, and you got to get saved harder next time. And maybe, why isn't God listening to me? And so, while I say it's a 5 on a 10 scale, there's that damage that was really done. And of course, growing up, going to high school and not going to dances and kind of being forced to make up excuses for why I didn't go, or trying to act like I was too cool to go to a school dance. I mean, that does a lot of damage to a person. And I think it takes well into adulthood to recognize that.
Right, right. Yeah, you share a story in your book of you went on an activity and you got dropped back
Oh
off
God,
at your
yeah.
house on the way there to change your clothes because it didn't fit their standards. And you mentioned the book like your parents were super upset about it, like they thought it was
Mhm.
so weird. Do you feel like your parents gave you a kind of foundation of questioning things, even though they were inside this rigid community? It sounds like they let you kind of chart your own course in some ways throughout your childhood.
I would say a little bit, not so much for my brother and sister. For me, a little bit, and part of that was just I pushed a lot of boundaries. I mean, I was drinking at 16 years old, and I did that because and probably all your listeners can relate to this. You go to a restaurant and the forbidden bar is at the restaurant and all these colorful bottles, and they're like, don't go over there because it's super fun and you can't be part of the
Yep.
world. Well, as a kid, you're just sitting around going, well, that's where I want to go now. But
Right.
my parents did give a lot of flexibility in not really questioning faith. Now, they didn't, if I questioned something, they weren't like disciplining me or anything. It's nothing like that. But I think some of the insanity, my folks were kind of keen to realize this is stupid. Not the drinking stuff, by the way, not the dancing stuff, but like
Right.
and the story you're referring to. I showed up. We were going to Six Flags in north of Chicago, and I showed up in shorts because it was like 100 degrees that day, and they literally drove the bus 15 minutes out of the way back to my house so that I could go in and put on jeans. And I remember getting off the bus at Six Flags, and all the kids walking by were looking at us, and they're like, "Are they Amish?" Like because
Right. Yeah.
everybody's in these long dresses and we have jeans on, and so yeah, I mean, some flexibility, but still within the rigid of the religion for sure. And now I will say, my parents came to the same realization I did about IFB at the same time I did, so they can look
Yeah.
back and shake their head as well.
What time was that for you, and what sparked you realizing like this movement is not the only way to, figure out your life purpose? Like this is not the be all end all for me.
I mean, look, even through college, I was involved. And, on the one hand, I had the rebellious life. I was a fraternity member. And then on the other hand, right, everybody's
Yeah.
got their two sides in IFB. And I think I basically left church altogether.
Mm.
Once I graduated college, I went into the military. I'm an Air Force pilot. And I would go occasionally to church and then not go. And I still had faith, but like, that. And I think it was through that distance from the church when I came to, there was no like awakening moment for me. I guess there was, and that was a little later in life, but it was more like, boy, this is just miserable.
Mm.
Like what you hear people talk all the time about the love of God and the joy of faith. And you're like, I've never experienced that in my life because all I've
Right.
experienced is like judgmentalism and falseness and being fake. And yeah, so for me it was a long journey, and I would say it's still one I'm even going through. Like I said, I do take my faith seriously now, and one of the things I struggle with is recognizing that God does love me. And
Mm.
for me, cerebrally, academically, I can say that, but in the heart, it's hard because of this foundation that was built in my life.
And it all feels so conditional. Like it feels like if I do the
Totally.
wrong thing, all that unconditional love disappears really quickly.
What's interesting too is like, so as you well know, in the IFB, it's like the chief enemy is Catholics, right? Or
Mhm.
or even other Protestants that somehow do something differently. But they would always say like, oh, Catholics believe you can lose your salvation. How horrible is that? And this is within the last year I've come to realize actually that is less of a burden than what the IFB puts on people. Because what the IFB says is, yeah, once you're saved, you're always saved. But if you're out sinning, you probably were never really saved. So actually, what they're setting out is this condition that seems impossible to get to. That's way worse than like this idea that Catholicism is critical because you can lose your salvation. The idea that you could never attain it and you never know why you can't is more damaging than anything.
I've talked to a couple of therapists that specialize in religious trauma, and they talk about religious scrupulosity is a thing they're seeing frequently, where you overanalyze and overthink everything. And it's exactly what you've said. And I've had that experience too, where you're sitting there and you're crying at the altar and you're praying a prayer, and then the next day you go, "Did I cry enough? Was I sincere enough?
Yeah.
Was me crying too theatrical? Like, was that me really crying, or was I trying to convince God?" Like, you go through layer after layer after layer of trying to make sure you're on the right path, and it's extremely difficult. And everybody around you, like you said, isn't showing their weaknesses, so you just assume everyone
Right.
else is not struggling the same way. And it's
Yep.
it's a it's a messy blender to be put into, especially as a kid where
It
you're not.
is. And on top of that, remember, they also say, so if you go up to the altar and you have a real emotional experience, what's the backup then? It's like, remember, emotion is not faith. And
Mhm.
so it was always like, okay, if I had a moment where I felt emotional about God, like, oh, I've got to, well, they remember it's like emotion isn't faith. Faith is this cold, stoic thing.
Yeah.
And, for me, I remember in college at one point I'd gone to who now is a fantastic guy, but my college pastor, now he's really on the right side of things. But I'd gone to him and I said, "Hey, I really want to step up my faith." And he goes, "Well, then you need to go to Thursday night visitation." And I got to tell you, there is nothing that brings more like disgusting feeling to me than Thursday night visitation. Okay.
Right.
And in a college town, no less, by the way. So now you're going to college, kids that are drinking and trying anyway. But and I just remember thinking, well, I don't want to do Thursday night visitation. I said that to him, and he goes, "Well, then you're not ready to step up your faith." I mean,
Mhm.
you look at that and you're like, it's a miracle anybody comes out of IFB with faith,
Right.
honestly, which is why you and I have so many people that we know that frankly ended up in jail or ended up in drugs and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's so much pressure. Well, you went from an environment where people, kind of wear a false face, and there is a lot of, superiority complexes and things. So let's talk about politics, because that sounds like you went from one version of that from religion to the other. Like, what are the similarities you see between like fundamentalist religion and this kind of polarizing world of politics and one-upsmanship between parties?
Yeah, I mean it's very similar, and it's interesting. I never thought about it, but is that a career choice I made because of that? You get good at kind of putting on a front, and politics, and there's nothing wrong with this generally. Like as a politician, you have to put up a front of what you want people to see or
Sure.
what you want them to vote for. If you don't want people being too real in politics, but that's the interesting thing is one of the things I've grown to be really sick of, and I think it's part of the reason I try to be so genuine in what I'm doing, and I hope it's that is, I really despise now kind of politician behavior, like
Mhm.
people that do things they don't believe in, and we can ascribe that every day we see that stuff happening, and so I think there is certainly a connection where look, if you're a Democrat, you kind of have to hold to whatever the Democratic Party is, those values. There's nothing wrong with that. And same with like when the Republican Party was normal, saying, okay, we believe in smaller government, strong national defense. And you may go out of that on a few areas, but generally you're going to fight for that. That's okay, right? I mean, again, that's just the nature of politics. But what happens is people in politics begin to conform and convince themselves. Let's just be honest. When Donald Trump came on the scene, the Republican Party, whether you like what the Republican Party is today or not, when Donald Trump came on the scene, he changed the party.
Right.
I'm not different in what I believe in politics, but yet the GOP kicked me out. So that tells
Yeah.
you everything there is. And when he came along, everybody had to make a decision, either leave, and many did, or conform. And,
Mm.
so many people conformed and they walk around with a fake mask and now they feign outrage about, Haitian migrants or something like that, which maybe they, 6 years ago would have gone on TV and talked about the blessing of Haitian migrants and the blessing of being America. And you see that, and they can eventually convince themselves that what they're doing is right, but they live in pure misery. And I think just not that anybody should care about this, but a lot of the politicians through this will probably have a lot of damage coming out just internally and personally. Like, who am I really? What do I really believe?
One of the things when you first reached out to me, I wasn't familiar with you. Like, I feel like I keep up more than most with politics, but there's also so much to keep track of, So like I
I became
quickly
much
looked
more
at
famous of recent. Yeah, don't worry.
right.
I That's normal.
I quickly was looking up, and then I was like, he's a politician, he's this, like you have these things that flash through your mind. And then,
Hmm.
I've always been, even when I was religious, I leaned more left. And so I was like, Republican congressman reaching out. I mean, just, like, this is interesting. Did he write the wrong person? Like, what's going on? And since then, I've watched quite a bit of what you've put out. I've been following you. And then I read your book, Renegade, which is well
Oh,
worth
thanks.
reading. Reading through it, I got a sense that you are this type of politician that people seem to be nostalgic for right now, where it's like
Mhm.
you have your positions, like you have some positions that I've looked through on your record, that some that I disagree with, some I agree with, but I've seen you sit down and be able to have conversations across the aisle in very public ways and talk about principle, like over party. And why do you think there's been this shift from people having these strong principles and voting accordingly to now you have to toe the party line, and that line is moving every day? It's what does this figurehead in my group say? Why do you think that shift has happened?
Well, look, I'll just be quite honest with you. That shift has really happened in the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And I think that has driven the national narrative. I mean, look, I can look back, and I talk about this a lot in the book. I can look back at the I get elected in 2010. I was actually always pretty moderate for the Republican Party. I thought I was conservative because I was a conservative in Illinois, which is a very, obviously left leaning state.
Right.
And so when I got to DC and I was up against other conservatives from South Carolina, I realized like, oh, I'm actually kind of a moderate. But
Right.
I think for it was so when Donald Trump came on the scene, so okay, that's where I was at. So if you look back at 2010, I can say, yeah, I see the trend of the party. And I talk about this where anger, can raise money and, division and fear is what drives dollars. And it's frankly why in the Bible, fear is warned about all the time because you can manipulate people. Man, I know how to manipulate people if I wanted to using fear, and I could probably get anything I want. And so that became addictive because now it's this fight between Republicans and Democrats and candidates to raise more money. And you all of a sudden realize you have this dark art that you can raise money on. And so that trend was happening. And then Donald Trump came on the scene. And when Donald Trump came on the scene, he stirred up. So there's always been this thing where politicians would say, yeah, we can play with fire a little bit, but our ultimate goal is to try to steer us to a better spot, whatever our vision is on that. Donald Trump came along and made the decision that he doesn't care what a better spot is. I truly believe he doesn't like have any affection for whatever the future of America is. And so he played with that fire and stoked it and stoked it and stoked it. And then throughout that time, people had to make a decision. Do I get on board with that or don't I? And I got to tell you, when we talk about identity, it's part of the reason it's so hard to leave the IFB because that is your identity. And, anybody that leaves believes that for a period that they're probably going to hell for it until they, kind of get some distance and recognize that that's not God. But you feel the same way when you're leaving a political movement and leaving a party is like, I'm going to lose my identity. Think about this as a US congressman, except for the White House, any room I walked into, I was the most powerful person in that room. And I had everybody's attention. That's addictive. And so what you see is the party became surrounded by to stay in power. I need Donald Trump. Donald Trump stirred up the people that have been programmed by Fox News for so long to be his base. So he made you have to pay that price. And I'll be honest, the Democrats haven't had as much of that issue. I mean, even when they've had their kind of far left movements, they've pushed back against it. And the Democrats have stayed kind of left to center left. And so, yes, I think it's a problem in the country in terms of personalities and being surrounded by that and less principle, but more so in the Republican Party. And I just think it's important not for anybody to become friends and understanding of somebody that supports insurrection. That to me is a completely different thing. But if you have somebody on the center right and somebody on the center left, like getting to understand that both of those folks want the best for their country, they just see it through a different filter, is what's going to save our democracy. Otherwise, you don't have democracy if you're unable to talk to each other. It doesn't matter what you call it, but it's not democracy.
I was born in 1995, so it was interesting reading in your book your takeaways from 9/11, which obviously it's September 16th as of this recording, so this is a really recent kind of time of memory about this. It's amazing to me hearing the impact that 9/11 had on people during that time, especially you were just about college age during that time, listening to the Howard Stern show, you hear about this attack. So you have this rush of patriotism to, I'm going to go defend my country. And you were one of many that signed up to do just that. And I noticed among my peer group, there's a different experience with 9/11, a different interaction point, which is by the time we were of age to even care or understand anything about politics, there was this mood of suspicion of the government. There was a distrust because there was wars that were started on the back of that were, not even in the countries connected to the attacks. And so there's this cynicism. And I think as much as we talk about, the quote unquote boomer crowd supporting Trump or the old white guy, that's angry about his country, I'm seeing a lot of friends of mine who are in their 20s that are, saying, yeah, let's drain the swamp, or this guy is not
Yeah.
like them. He's not a politician. And I think they get left out of these conversations a lot. What would you say to people who find a Trump figure appealing, who find this, the career Democrat politician that's running, they find them distasteful, or they associate the government with really bad stuff? Like, I'm going to be honest, even for me, it's hard to be patriotic at times because it feels like
Mhm.
the system's a mess. It's not looking out for me. Like, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, and it's a great question because, and I think it's pretty typical historically after times of war that there are times of like consternation or things get stirred up. And, obviously, the patriotism of that moment wears off and the cost of that moment or bad decisions and things like that. Part of it is, look, again, let's go back to what I was talking about, the incentivization of fear and of the dark arts. It is in my interest, if I'm running for reelection, to run against Washington, D.C., even if I've been in Congress for 10 years. And so what I would do is go home to my district, and I didn't really do a lot of this, but let's say generically a politician, go back to the district and say, everybody in D.C. sucks. They're awful. I'm the only one that's here fighting for you. And reelect me so I can go back and get those SOBs and stop them. Well, now you multiply that by 435 congressional districts. You multiply that by 100 US senators in every presidential election. And eventually, the politicians that we look up to lead us, and we may hate politicians, but ultimately we do look up to them for leadership. And they're reflecting back to us that angst about the government, the fact that the institutions don't work, that everything's terrible, they're the only ones that can save it. And to me, it's a miracle that anybody still has faith in institutions. And honestly, I do, because I think government for, of, and by the people is actually pretty awesome because I lived through it, but it's very flawed and bad things happen. So I think that's part of it. I also think there is a very unique problem among young men right now. Now, this is a very deep conversation, so I'll just touch on the surface of it. So for a while, there was this idea that anything masculine was toxic. Okay. That was wrong. That doesn't really exist anymore. There was kind of a short period, I guess like around 2016, 2017, whenever that was. That created a lot of anger, I think, in young men that are like, well, what is my role in the world? What is my purpose? And then the problem is we the pendulum corrected back to what should be a good definition of masculinity, which is, to me, protecting the vulnerable, fighting for people that can't fight for themselves. Because men, look, we are built to be kind of fighters, to go into action. That's why I think so many people commit suicide after war, is because they reach kind of that apex feeling of manhood and always try to chase it for however many years after. That's another deep conversation. But what ends up happening is, Trump comes along, or let's just call it like the influencer right, and start, the Andrew Tates, and they say, look, you can be masculine. Don't listen to them saying you can't be masculine. And here's what masculinity is. It's being a jerk, right? It's punching down. It's going after immigrants. It's going after the border. It's going after women. But women don't have a right to the same things we do. We're men. That's toxic masculinity. And I think that's the attraction of Donald Trump to those people specifically, because he acts like he doesn't care what people think. You want to know a little secret? He really cares what people think.
Right.
I know him. He is so concerned with the opinion of others. But his magic power is that he doesn't seem that way. So it's a deep conversation we could do an hour on, but for me, that kind of touches a little of kind of two big issues why the young generation is more susceptible than we ever thought they would be.
The healthy version is kind of chasing purpose, and I think there's a good thing there. And I've talked about this even in, it's a fundamentalist trait that I am thankful for, is that I have a tenacity to go after something I think is right. And so, even though what I think is right has shifted in some ways, and some things I thought were super important really weren't, when it comes to things like abuse of power within the church, like, I'm going to step up, and I find a lot of purpose in calling that stuff out. I think now the call is not to purpose, but it's to power. It's now I can be the biggest person in the room. I can have the biggest tie in the room. I can stand on the biggest stage in the city, and, hold the biggest rallies, like whatever you want to throw in there. It's like that pursuit has dominated everything else. And I think that's a really, really scary thing.
Well, and let me give you a quick example. So when our very first hearing on the January 6th committee, I got choked up because I was talking about these police officers and how beaten down they looked. And I reminded them that they won.
Thank you to our witnesses. I never expected a day to be quite as emotional for me as it has been. I've talked to a number of you and gotten to know you. I think it's important to tell you right now, though. You guys may individually feel a little broken. You guys all talk about the effects you have to deal with, and You know, you talk about the impact of that day. But you guys won. You guys held. You know, democracies are not defined by our bad days. We're defined by how we come back from bad days, how we take accountability for that. And for all the overheated rhetoric surrounding this committee, our mission is very simple. Let's define the truth, and it's to ensure accountability.
I mean, literally, it truly doesn't bother me, but I think it's a good example. You know, I get called by the right crying at him. You know, Trump calls me crying at him.
And Adam Kinzinger, you ever see him? He gets on television, he cries all the time. He starts crying. I don't know. Governor, is that an act or is he serious? He's crying all the time. We call him crying, Adam Kinzinger.
You know, you'll see the memes pop up of me getting choked up. And what that's showing, because to me, having emotion for something like that is actually masculine. It's feminine too, but it's masculine, right? There's no shame in that trait. But that shows weakness to some of these folks. And in reality, their whole life is weakness because they're scared to death. They're scared to death that somebody is going to take away their rightful place in this country, which is why they hate women and why they hate immigrants.
We brought you reports last night that Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois had been seen crying again. We promised to get to the bottom of that story. Members of Congress are technically speaking sent to Washington to vote and not to weep, and so we thought it was worth following up. Tonight we have an update on that.
I know so many people, and I'm sure you do as well. It's probably even more frustrating in your position. I know so many people I talk to who I'm just like, how do you not see this? Like, how do you not see this glaring flaw in either the person you're supporting or the party that you're affiliating with? And much like dealing with fundamentalists, because I think it's fundamentalism across the board, whether we're talking politics or religion, the hardest thing to do to me is to communicate with somebody without having them retreat deeper and deeper into it. You know, like in the church world, you know, when you would start pointing out something wrong, they'd say, we were taught to expect persecution. That's what this is. Yeah. It just further affirms we're right. And I think when you see somebody critique, say, a Donald Trump, people go, look, they're attacking him because he's right. And that's like an endless cycle. It's hard to break out of. What have you seen most helpful in flipping somebody's perspective or not pushing them into defense mode the minute you start a conversation?
I mean, it's a really tough question. And I guess I don't have the best answer because it really is, you know, we talk about IFB as a cult. I think Deep MAGA, just being frank, is a cult as well because it's based on a person. If you go outside of the orthodoxy of that, you're excommunicated. You know, Donald Trump, you know, quote, and it's sensitive, obviously, to say it this way, given this moment, but kind of politically executes people like me and Liz Cheney as examples to others to not leave the cult. And so I think the best thing you can do as an individual to somebody that's in it is, first off, try to avoid convincing them. Like, this is something that's very hard for me, by the way, because like you, I sit there and I go, well, now, if they ask you, you know, why, then yeah, I mean, unload, right, at that point. But if they don't ask you, you're not going to convince them. What you can is still love them, and particularly for family members. Now, I have a handful of family members I don't talk to anymore, not immediate family, but extended family that excommunicated me because of my position on Trump. And, you know, in that case, I forget about them. I'm not going to let them wear me down or bring me down. But I think the best thing you can do is, and I say this when I give my speeches, by the way, is like, we all carry the weight of the world on our shoulders, specifically with politics. We feel like, boy, I got to tweet more. I fall into this trap. I got to tweet more, or I got to say this more because otherwise, you know, Trump's going to win again, or Kamala's going to win it, whatever it is. Like, drop the weight of the world off your shoulders, right? And just recognize that what you can affect is your own self. And you can have very minimal but impactful effects around you, but really you can only affect yourself. So in terms of breaking the kind of spell on some people, I don't think there's any magic. I haven't found anything that really works except raw power. And that's why I think, frankly, I'm so invested in Donald Trump losing in November, because I think there's not going to be anything that wakes people up like losing power. And so I think there is a reality to that. But on the individual level, you're right. And by the way, you see this because you speak the language like I do. And all of the things folks are saying, you see that apocalyptic end times language that other people, mainstream media doesn't catch. When you hear globalist, right? A lot of people think that's like anti-Jewish. It can be in certain contexts, but it's actually like New World Order end time stuff, right? This is where the Left Behind series comes in.
Yeah.
And so you see how they melt religion and religious things with politics. And by the way, if you really believe in that stuff, boy, you can't leave the Republican Party, or you're going to wear the mark of the beast next thing you know.
Do you think, because I notice that all the time in mainstream media, where they'll say, how could evangelicals vote for someone who's antithetical to everything they believe? And then I grew up in that world and I go, he kind of sounds like a pastor that would have came in and spoke at our churches.
Yeah.
Do you think Trump, because I reject the idea that Trump's a dumb guy. Like, he clearly is not. He's very strategic. How much do you think he's aware of the religious strings that he's pulling on, the religious fears that he's tapping into? Because he surrounds himself with lots of Christians. Do you think he's being very intentional with that, or do you think he accidentally stumbled into it and has kept driving forward in that realm?
I think he accidentally stumbled into it, and now I think he's very intentional about it. I think he's very intentional. So in 2015, he comes down the escalator. He's just throwing out immigrant rhetoric. I mean, Christians rejected him. They rejected him until who was the Supreme Court justice that died. And you remember, and then all of a sudden there's a Supreme Court opening, and that's going to tip the balance of abortion. And it was in that time frame, because Mitch McConnell made the decision, I'm not going to appoint anybody. I'm not going to appoint Merrick Garland. We're going to leave this open through the election. That's when you saw religious leaders go from this Ted Cruz, who I can't stand, theology of like, I'm going to go against Donald Trump, to all of a sudden we have to have Donald Trump win. And he saw the power. So my wife worked at the RNC at that time, and she talks about that they would have pastors get on these conference calls and pray, for the future and Donald Trump. And he saw and harvested the power in that. No matter how intelligent he is book smart wise, he's got a lizard brain that understands how crowds react. He understands when he's harnessing power, and he felt it. And he is very intentional about that. And you see that in some of the things he says. You see that in the assassination attempt, where he's like, they're coming after me because, right? And of course, we need to condemn the assassination attempts. That politics was invented so that this stuff didn't happen.
Right.
But he knows how to harvest that. He knows how to use that. And he does it very well. It's why he was interested in Israel. It's why he was interested in the Abraham Accords, because he knew what that meant to the evangelical community. And they are sitting there. You can think about the leaps they had to take, because now who is it? Jonathan Cahn, who's the guy that wrote the thing about, Donald Trump is really this old king who was also flawed, but he saved civilization. And look at the parallels here. And this is intentional. It takes that kind of thing for an evangelical to say, yeah, God uses flawed people. And my answer to that is, yeah, maybe God does use flawed people. But at some point, don't you think God would say this guy is discrediting the church more than anybody has ever discredited the church? And maybe that's not his purpose.
Well, I'm curious, you mentioned lizard brain, and I want to speak to the conspiracy theorists out there who are like, no, actual lizard brain? No, there's a lot of people who have fallen deep into those wormholes in evangelical circles. And conspiracy there, I mean, January 6th, I've heard tons of different conspiracy theories about that, even to the extent some say that nobody that was there was an actual citizen. It was all people in the government, just standing in as that. I've heard that it is, extremist cults on the left that are trying to make the right look bad. And then just recently I was interviewing somebody who said, I saw friends that I know, in my own reporting, I saw that there was a bus director from a church that was present. So clearly there's a lot of disjointed narratives. As someone who actually was on the committee that investigated January 6th, what was your biggest takeaway? And, what would you say to somebody who goes like, that whole thing has been overblown in a really huge way? Because those people are still there in large numbers.
Well, they're there in large numbers. And what interestingly happened is everybody after January 6th was embarrassed that it happened. Donald Trump was persona non grata for like 3 weeks. But eventually, and remember, all these people getting arrested were all like mea culpas and I'm sorry. And I fell into this moment. And then Fox News and that right-wing ecosystem came in and kind of surrounded these people in prison and convince them that they were actually political prisoners and not that they broke the law. And that's what then kind of solidified this idea that they're just that, political prisoners. I'd say this because, I do think part of the thing that fed into January 6th in terms of the violence was people that were angry about what happened the summer prior in 2020 with the riots. And I actually was activated with the Guard to Minneapolis with the riots. And obviously they were terrible, right? They shouldn't have happened. But you can destroy cities and not threaten democracy. The second that you try to destroy the peaceful transfer of power by force, you never will have a democracy that survives that. When you convince half of the country that their vote didn't count because the election was stolen. I mean, we fought a revolution in 1776 over the idea that we didn't have representation, that we didn't have a vote, we didn't have a voice. You can see it doesn't take that many political iterations of being convinced that the system is rigged for there to be real violence. And the truth of the matter is, the system isn't rigged. The truth of the matter is, Donald Trump lost. Sorry about that. Maybe you should have gone and figured out how to win more people over next time. And so the people that believe the conspiracies about January 6th or says it doesn't matter a lot, I look at it and say those are people that have been programmed by the media ecosystem that has a vested financial interest in convincing them of that and convincing them that they're hooked. Because I look at the 3 months prior to January 6th, Donald Trump telling the Department of Justice to just say the election was corrupt and then leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. So all you got to do is just say it's corrupt, even if it's not, and then we'll do the rest to destroy this. Look, I get that there's a lot of things in America people don't like, but we've got it pretty darn good as a country. And let me tell you, if it falls apart, you have no idea how bad it can be. I've been to war. I've seen war-torn areas. The people that rely on Walgreens for their diabetes medicine, they'll be gone in 2 weeks because Walgreens is not going to continue to ship insulin to their local, CVS. So that's the kind of thing I think people need to be aware of.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are concerned about this in very real ways that we're past the point of no return, that things have gotten to such a boiling point where, if Trump lost this election, or if Trump won this election or whatever the outcome is, people have this thought in their head of like, well, what if we get January 6th times 10, times 1,000, times 1,000,000? Like, do you think we're past the point of no return in many ways as a country? Do you have an optimism that like things are shifting? Like, what's your kind of temp check on the country? And I know this is very subjective, but I'm curious what your perspective is.
Look, I am generally optimistic long. Okay. In the short, a little pessimistic because I do think there is threat of violence after this election. I mean, and it's not going to be at the U.S. Capitol and it's not going to be on January 6th. It could be at state houses. If you think about, let's take a state like Arizona run by, Republican legislature that has to certify election wins for it to be legitimate. Let's say Kamala wins Arizona. Can you see, I could see Republican House simply refusing to certify her the winner, which has never been done. You set up a constitutional crisis. That's a concern to me. The loyalty of the military is to the Constitution, not to the president. Generally, that's a good thing. But what happens if Donald Trump convinces people that the Constitution requires them to defect from the military, right? So these are things we have to be aware of. And I think go into eyes wide open because part of the problem with January 6th is we had a failure of imagination. I actually predicted violence on the 1st of January. And, Kevin McCarthy specifically basically dismissed me for that prediction and said I was wrong. And so, we have to have this imagination. But, so I preface with the bad news. The good news is, I think what you're feeling in the Kamala race, and I was at the DNC, you're feeling this optimism boil up a little bit, at least in the Democrats. I was on the other side of Obama 08. I was a McCain guy, but that was kind of like what we were sensing was happening in Obama 08. But I've always sensed that as angry as America is and divided and like there is this undercurrent that's growing and you never know it until these waves pass. But there's this undercurrent of growing of people that are sick of this and want to heal the system. I mean, you probably look back at the comments on this podcast when you talk about, how do we get people that can just disagree disagreeably again or agreeably again? You're going to have a lot of comments saying yes, yes, yes. There is this undercurrent of people desperate for that. And so I think you will see in 2028 and even before leaders come along with that message. And I think they're going to be rewarded for it. So I do think in the long term, this country is going to be fine. We're going to learn how to deal with the new media environment and this divisive environment. But I do think in the short term, we need to be aware of the dangers and that we're not out of the woods.
I tend to be optimistic long too. And I think we've seen Trump slow so much with this momentum. And I don't see any other candidates that are trying to be Trump Jr., like really gaining traction. I think once Trump is not a figurehead in that world, I think we're going to see more sensible, I hope, more sensible candidates, coming to the forefront to pick from. Because, the idea of holding your nose and voting just is tiring to people. And I think that's why there is optimism, like, for a Kamala Harris. There is somebody that, we're not worried about her, mental capacity, her physical health. We're not worried about, extremely divisive rhetoric. Like it feels a lot easier. It's easier pill to swallow.
It does. And here's the other thing is, look, let's just look at this from a 50,000 or 100,000 foot overview of history. We've been debating abortion, guns, and taxes for 100 years. Okay. My guess is if we quantum leap forward to 2024, we're going to be debating abortion, guns, and taxes. Okay. This is that's the human nature. This is what you happen when you live in a self-governing society. And I think people are understanding, yes, there's these differences, there's these things that divide us. But look, they're always going to be there. And with Kamala specifically, it's like, but I'm not sure the faith in democracy is always going to be there unless she wins. I think that's helpful. And I think people are starting to get there's this desire to be like, let's disagree agreeably. And I'm optimistic that we're there. But like I said, again, I don't think it's automatic at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like you said, we don't have to carry the weight of the world. It's like our own relationships and building. I have a close friend who we actually joked about doing a podcast a long time ago. And we're like, we should do like the purple pod and be like, I'll be the blue side. But neither of us were extreme enough to feel like it would even be interesting. It's like, I agree with you on this and disagree on this. And that would be the show. You need like the two firebrands to make it interesting. But all that to say, like, it's encouraging to me when you can have those conversations and walk away still friends and know, like, he's not voting because he hates immigrants. Like, I know he's voting because he thinks this economic policy is best. But like, it's great to have those relationships. And if we can all have those individually, nationally, things look a lot better. I think it's like the social media where it's like me and a guy in Idaho I've never met fighting is not good for anybody. Like, it just doesn't work.
No. Yeah. And I'll be honest, man, I prefer relationships with people that don't agree with me on stuff, but know how to like joke about it. So there's a documentary coming out called The Last Republican that I'm in, and the director, Steve Pink, very far left guy. And I'm center right. And that's kind of the plot of this documentary a little bit, is that we get along. I jokingly call him a communist. He jokingly calls me whatever. And I enjoy that. Otherwise, the only thing I can hang out with somebody and do is drink beer, and that's unhealthy. So for me, it's fun to have differences, and I think we should rediscover that again. It's fun, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we're coming near the end of our time. I got to ask you this question because as someone who is from the Republican Party, and you're seeing Trump come in and attack fake news, what's your take on the JD Vance comment? If we need to make up stories to get people's attention, that's what we're going to do. Like, we all know a lot of politicians do that, but to hear someone say that on a news network, like, what's your take that it's that blatant now that like, we're just going to say what we need to say to win and that's it?
Well, it triggers something in me that's much deeper, which is a bit of a fear, to be honest with you, because we've always had this feeling in this country that if somebody would say something like that there's an adult that's going to come along and say, you can't say that, or no, we can't really do that. Right. But the reality is the adults are the ones doing it now. It's Donald Trump. It's JD Vance. And when JD Vance says we can make up a story, and that's not the front page of every newspaper, we've become numb to the outrage. And, and I get it, the human condition, we don't want to read about every crazy thing Donald Trump says every day, but we also can't grow numb to that as a society. And what that triggers in me, the fear it triggers in me, is a concern I have that I've been unwilling to entertain, but I'm kind of worried about, is that in some cases, when you talk about like the migrants eating cats and dogs story or whatever the outrage of the day is, that the people spreading it may not actually believe it anyway, but they may not care. And that to me is much more frightening than somebody that actually believes migrants are eating their neighbors' cats and dogs, than somebody that's saying, yeah, it's not true, but I don't care, because the only thing that matters to me is raw power. And so, yeah, it's frightening to me. It's why J.D. Vance went from being this kind of conservative icon hero to a complete clown, because, you know, he called out Donald Trump in 2016. Now he is Donald Trump. And I'll just say to everybody, you know, look, like, recommit yourself to truth. You know, that's the key. Just recommit yourself to truth. And it doesn't have to mean agree, like my truth or your truth, but just recommit yourself to saying, I'm going to believe truth. And all this other stuff shakes out when that happens, because you won't be abused. You won't be taken advantage of. And just like happened at the IFB, when they would abuse your fear to maintain control, that's what is done in politics every day. And we have to reject that. And we're the only ones that can.
Absolutely love that. Well, Adam, thank you so much for making this happen. I hope it's not the last time we connect. I really appreciate the conversation. And thanks for being the first, like, overtly, I think, political guest that I've had on the show. So we'll see how this one goes. Maybe
Sorry,
read the
everybody,
comments,
but
maybe don't. We'll see. But I really appreciate it. Thank you.